And of course, we know that them being witnesses, they're sharing God's testimony. And so, they're sharing God's testimony, and it's not going to stop until it has been completed, which you'll continue on and you'll see in verse 7. When they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. But that won't happen until they're finished with their testimony. And so the point then is that God's witnesses testify while the nations are being trampled, are trampling the holy city. Prophesying and witnessing should not fail during that period, but until the completion, of that. So when we look at verse 7, we see that the beast is brought up, and we heard about that in, what was it? Was that chapter 9. You go back to verse 2, talking about the bottomless pit. Verses 1 and 2 talking about the bottomless pit. We know that the locust, the smoke from the furnace would have came up out of this pit. And we talked about the king of this is the king of Abaddon, the king of Apollyon, that pointing to Satan. And so Satan is behind this evil that is contained in this bottomless pit. And what is coming up out of this bottomless pit? We have the locust there. And then it talks about how this beast is coming up out of this same bottomless pit, the same containment of evil, if you will. In chapter 13, of course, we'll get more into who the beast is there. But when we consider this, again, the beast won't overcome these witnesses and kill them until the message, until the witnessing has been complete. And of course, you look at the late date, when we consider, really the beast, for both the early and late date, the beast from the abyss assumes a lead role in chapter 13, and it points to the Roman Empire. But the one that is going to be, that the beast is going to devour per se, or the beast is going to really get into, that's where you get into more of a different scenario. But we see again that the beast, it overcomes the witnesses, but not until they have finished their testimony. And so that is what we kind of can see there. Although the witnesses were opposed, beaten, and driven from place to place, we see that the gospel was preached to all creation under heaven in the apostolic age. And so when we consider the late date concerning what would be finished, the gospel message would have been preached to all creation. And so that's kind of what that is looking like there. When you look at, where is it? Verse 8. I left my, right there. So going to verse 8. So when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. And so this is another difference you have between the early date and the late date. The great city is going to be looking at, as being depicted as Rome, while the early date will say something different, of course, point to Jerusalem. And so the reason for this in verse 8 is that Rome is, the great city, that terminology is always pointed to a world city like Babylon. Babylon was big, and even when we look at the beast, when it talks about in the book of Daniel, you talk about the four beasts, and Babylon is depicted there. Medo-Persia? You have Greece, and then you have Rome. And so the big argument, concerning why it can't be the early date is because you have four beasts, and Jerusalem is not one of them. And so that was one of the things I was really holding on to, before I really just look more into it. But so what Ken Green, some of you probably heard that name. I think he was over in, Tennessee or somewhere. But he's long past now. But he says here that Sodom was destroyed because of its immorality. We have Sodom and Gomorrah being mentioned. We have Egypt being mentioned. And then we have the place where our Lord was crucified is mentioned. And so Ken Green says Sodom was destroyed because of its immorality. Egypt was known for its bondage and persecution of God's children. And then the city where Jesus was crucified, Jerusalem, was known for its rejection of the Savior. And so when you look at all three, well, all three were true of Rome. That rejection of the Savior, persecution and bondage like Egypt, and then Sodom was destroyed because of its immorality. And of course, when you look at Rome and all that would have happened there, it seems to fit this picture of where the great city is being pointed to as being Rome. And so interpreting this section, this kind of really brings it together before we do move into the early date. The measuring of the temple would again assure God's people that he knew exactly who was faithful to him. Yes, the nations were outwardly raging, but God knows who belong to him. Even though the nations had rejected God, he continued to send his message out again. Again, the witnesses powerfully proclaimed the message of God during the entirety of the time that the nations were trampling the holy city. And we see, the concept of the beast coming and overcoming and killing these witnesses. It appears that God's cause failed. His witnesses are killed by the beast and the earth rejoices. But we see that it's only for a short time, 3.5 days. We look at 7 as being the number for completion. Well, half of that is 3.5. We see that the contempt the world has even for God is shown by how they even treated the bodies of the witnesses. I mean, they're laying them out in the street and they're not, they're just leaving them there. It's disrespect to God's people and even to God, of course. And the fact that they're presenting presents to one another, it's because they no longer were tormented by the message. But after, of course, again, 3.5 days, God's witnesses rise and ascend to heaven. We see that God had not been defeated as as the enemies would have thought. His enemies could only watch as they would have risen to heaven, as they would have overcome, as they would have had this victory. And then it gets into talking about an earthquake. Let's see. I want to read that again. So verse 13, actually verse 12. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." Then they went up into heaven in the cloud, and their enemies watched them. And in that hour there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. See again that an earthquake destroys 1/10 of the city and 7,000 people. And this would have just been a depiction of a harbinger or announcement of God's judgment about the third woe that is to come. But we see that the first woe, you go back to chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. We talked about that being the consequence of sin. The second woe we just looked at was the rejection of God's message. And then the third woe would be the destruction of man's kingdom. And you'll go, you look at Daniel 2 and just kind of put that together there. But that's concerning the late day. And really, again, a lot of times it's just more of a general concept rather than getting very, very specific. Now, of course, you look at the early date, it gets a lot more specific with a lot of these things. And so let's look back in verse 1. And again, hopefully this PowerPoint should help just to kind of see the differences there. So verse 1, then there was given me a measuring rod like a staff. John receives this measuring rod like a staff. Someone said, "Get up and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And so when we look at the rod here, again, the rod like a staff in the late date talked about just the concept of measuring. But this one adds to it and says it's not only measuring, but it's also to punish. And the reason for that, you go to Proverbs 13:24. I think we know a whole lot about spare the rod, spoil the child. Proverbs 13:24, 22:15, 23:13, even 1 Corinthians 4:21. I think Paul there, he was saying, shall I come to you with a rod? Saying, shall I come to you with punishment? With just that vigor there? Should I come to you like that? And so when you really look at this rod, it's not only used to measure, but it's also to punish. And not that John would be the one punishing, But again, this just goes back to the vision of, John is pointing out something that God told him to, and God is going to be the one that is going to be doing the punishment. And he's going to send the nation, he's going to send Rome to destroy the temple of Jerusalem. And so we'll really look more into that as we do progress. And one thing that Ogden did want to make clear when he was talking about the measuring rod, because there's another measuring rod in chapter 21, but he says those two are different. There's in chapter 21, verses 15 and 16, there's a golden reed that is spoken, and it's also the concept of measuring, but that one is different from this one. This one is measuring, but it's also there to punish, and so that's the difference there. He says the New Jerusalem, chapter 21, the New Jerusalem was measured for preservation. The earthly Jerusalem here in chapter 11 is measured for destruction. John would find by measuring that the temple was completely defiled by its worshipers. Again, he's telling John, go measure the temple of God. I want you, John, to see something. Measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship in it. And so again, John would find by measuring that the temple was completely defiled by its worshipers. And really, when you look at this, going back to Josephus a lot for this, Josephus relates how the wicked Jews in the last half of the Roman Jewish war, they had corrupted the priesthood, they had defiled the temple, the sacrifices, and the worship to the degree that it was not acceptable to God or man. It was that bad. And so when we consider the temple of God, it is literally the temple in Jerusalem before its destruction. And it will go more into depth of, what part of the temple. John, verse 2, was only told to measure the temple, which included the holy place and the most holy place. But the one outside of it, again, verse 2, leave out the court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And so we see the outer court, or the outer place, are literally the outer courts in the holy city. It's not the holy or the holy of holies, it's outside of it. And he says that outside part has what? It has been given to the nations, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. And so you go back to places like Luke chapter 21, verses 23 through 24. This is where Jesus, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. He says, woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. For there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people, to these Jews. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And of course, you look at the until, it kind of goes to, the witnesses and, talking about the beast that, the beast wouldn't overcome until the message was, complete. So what we see here, again, Josephus talks a lot about this, and I think I have another PowerPoint. I wanted to read a little bit of Josephus as we do move forward. I was trying so hard not to be biased now, but it's really hard to be when I look at the early date. But so we see that the Gentiles were not necessarily responsible for the destruction of the temple proper. The seditious Jews were actually the ones responsible for its destruction, while the Romans destroyed everything else. And so you read in book 6, chapter 4, section 3, 4, and 5, just the highlighted part. This is Josephus, where he says, Titus, which is, Romans, Titus said that although the Jews should get upon that holy house and fight us thence, yet ought we not to avenge ourselves on things that are inanimate. He's talking about the temple. We're not going to destroy the temple. Leave the temple instead of the men themselves. We'll get the men, but we want to leave the temple. And that he was not in any case for burning down so vast a work as that was, because this would be a mischief to the Romans themselves, as it would be an ornament to their government while it continued. Skipping down to the last part of that paragraph. So he commanded that the chosen man that were taken out of the cohort should make their way through the ruins and quench the fire. And so, Titus is even trying to keep the temple from being burned down, which is very interesting. Section 4, now it is true that on this day the Jews were so weary and under such a consternation that they refrained from any attacks, but on the next day they gathered their whole force together and ran upon those that guarded the outward court of the temple. So you have those that are actually guarding the temple from being burnt down. Very boldly through the east gate, and this was about the second hour of the day. These guards received that their attack with great bravery, and by covering themselves with their shields before, as if it were with a wall, they drew their squadron close together. Yet was it evident that they could not abide there very long, but would be overborne by the multitude of those that sallied upon them, and by the heat of their passion. And so we see Caesar here looking from the Tower of Antonia that this squadron was likely to give way. So, you have those that are they're protecting the temple from being burnt down, because again, the orders were don't burn down the temple. Titus said not to burn down the temple. Get the man, everything else, but don't burn down the temple. We'll start at the last sentence of the second paragraph or second section. And as those Romans came back upon them, they retreated again until about the 5th hour of the day. They were overborne and shut themselves up in the inner court of the temple. And so you have this kind of back and forth battle between the Romans and the Jews, the seditious Jews here, and to the point of where the Romans overcome them for this little battle, and that the Jews, if I'm not mistaken, they're the ones that go inside of the temple for sanctuary, if you will. So Titus, he retired into the Tower of Antonia and resolved to storm the temple the next day, early in the morning, with his whole army, and to encamp around the holy house. But as for that house, God had for certain long ago doomed it by fire. And now that fatal day was come. And so skipping down, it says, although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves and were occasioned by them, for upon Titus's retiring, the seditious lay still for a little while and then attacked the Romans again, when those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning the inner court of the temple. But these Romans put the Jews to flight and proceeded as far as the holy house itself, at which one of the soldiers, notice this, one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders and without any concern or dread upon him, at so great an undertaking, and being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window. And then from there to talk about how, the temple is going up in flames. But we see it really points to the seditious Jews being the one that would have, they would be the cause for the temple being burned down. And so, just going back to the chapter, and I'll probably spend a whole lot of time on that. But you can look at that as we do move forward. So we see, going back to verses, let's see. So 42 months. It had been given to the nations. They will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Another, big thing here we see about why it very likely could have been the early date at the time that was the time that Revelation was written, because the Roman destruction was to literally last 42 months. It's very specific. The actual length of the war from the time Vespasian and his army entered Palestine in the spring of 67 AD until late summer of 70 AD. The whole war was considered a treading on Jerusalem. And then you go to the two witnesses. Again, you heard about just about everything there was to hear about it. But this one is interesting. Two witnesses, the early date is pointing to the law and the prophets, which, it really made sense to me. The two witnesses were the source of oil from where the nation of Israel drew her light. The law and the prophets were the sources of light to the Jews. I mean, you look at Matthew 5:17, 7:12, 11:30, all throughout Matthew, Acts, and even Romans. It was the prophecies of the law and the prophets that were to be fulfilled when the seventh angel sounded his trumpet. And so we see concerning these two witnesses that they're going and It said, if anyone wants to harm them, fire flows out of their mouths and devour their enemies. So if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this way. When we go back to, Moses and Elijah, well, who were they? What did they point to? They pointed to, and they embodied the law and the prophets. Elijah, the prophets, and Moses, the law. And so it really did make sense to me. So the law and the prophets continued to be esteemed by the Jews, and it was practiced in the temple until the sacrifice is ceased just days before the temple was destroyed. So there was a point of where, the law and the prophets would still continue to be witnessed, but we know that there will be a time that it would stop. It would be complete. Verse 7, when they had finished their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And you go back to verses 5 and 6, of course, again, you look at Moses and Elijah about, the droughts that would happen, the fire coming down from heaven. All this literally happened, by the hands of Elijah and by the hand of Moses, and really, the hand of God, but through Moses and through Elijah. And so this was kind of pointing back to what happened then. And it will, again, just support the law and the prophets. Those are the two witnesses, the law and the prophets. Verse 7, when we look at the concept of finished, that means brought to a full end. And so again, when they have finished their testimonies, the law and the prophets finish their testimony, the beast that comes up out of the abyss will make war with them and overcome them and kill them. And so what is this saying here? We know Moses and Elijah, well, they're already dead. So, what is this saying here? Again, it's going back to the law and the prophets. And so the practice of the law and the prophets, all the sacrifices and all these different things, that would one day be finished. And that will be, of course, at the destruction of Jerusalem. The law and the prophets would continue to testify by being taught and practiced until the practice ceased just days before the temple was destroyed. According to Josephus, the Jews were even well aware of the teaching of the law and the prophets concerning Jerusalem's destruction. The seditious Jews, however, they ignored and they denied it. But nonetheless, the law and the prophets were completely fulfilled. They were finished. And what God had said was going to happen earlier on, it happened. The destruction of Jerusalem happened. And so in that way, it was brought to a completion and, it would be finished. So verse 8 says, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. So, of course, when we look at the great city here, again, late date said Rome, but this one is pointing, and I put Rome there. I meant Jerusalem. I need to correct that. But Jerusalem, the great city in early date, is pointing to Jerusalem. And so when we look at this one, spiritually, Jerusalem was called Sodom in Egypt. We actually have scripture even for that. Deuteronomy 32:32 says, for their vine is from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison, their clusters bitter. And if you know anything about that chapter, that was talking about the Song of Moses and how, they would have to learn that song. And it's just interesting, you think about a bad song that, I'm singing about my future, and some of it, sounds good, but also some of it is bad. And so they're singing about their future, and this is one of where they're depicted as, a mystical Sodom. For their vine is from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison, their clusters bitter. And so we see that this, in that way can be pointing to Jerusalem. Jerusalem was often identified, Jerusalem was also identified with Egypt in Ezekiel chapter 23, likely because they also came from Egypt, Jeremiah 16:14. And so you have that comparison there. And then, of course, Jerusalem was where Jesus was crucified. So again, the great city pointing to Jerusalem, not Rome. Verse 8 is where you actually go back to Josephus, and we won't have time to read it, but it goes back to how the seditious Jews, they would have literally left their dead countrymen, to not be buried. They would have left them in the streets, and those, the Romans and even other bystanders were able to just see this, and it was not a pretty picture. Verse 9, those from the peoples and tribes and tongues and nations will look at their dead bodies for 3.5 days and will not permit their dead bodies to be laid in the tomb. And so when we move forward in verse 9, let's see. Yeah, so verse 9, so the point is that the Romans were there to subdue the Jews, but for this to be accomplished, again, Moses and the prophets, or the law and the prophets, had to be conquered also, which, goes back to the temple, the Holy of Holies, where all of that would have taken place. So that needed to be conquered first. Their laws were laid to rest when the sacrifice is ceased, and their bodies also symbolically lay dead in the street for 3.5 days, or half the time till the temple was completely destroyed. And so I know we don't have a whole lot of time. Verse 10 talks about, and those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate, and they will send gifts to one another because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. I like this part too, because we consider Israel as a whole. They were called to be set apart from the whole world pretty much. And, with them being set apart, that would be, others would not like that. You can just even imagine today as Christians, others say, oh, you think you're better than us. You won't do this with us. And kind of the same way you see this concept here, where they would have looked at, Jerusalem with disdain. It says, oh, you think you're better than us. And so in that sense, those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them and celebrate, and they will send gifts to one another because these two prophets, the law and the prophets, tormented those who dwell on the earth. So even that concept of them being set apart, the fact that the temple is now, burnt to the ground, well, people are rejoicing over it. And really, the Romans, if you will. So verse 12, and they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. Then they went up into heaven in the cloud, and their enemies watched them. The law, verse 12, the law and the prophets served their purpose on earth, we see. God, who gave the law and the prophets to the nations of Israel, is portrayed here as bringing them back to his throne. As they ascended to heaven in complete triumph and fulfillment, their enemies fully observed. Their enemies testified that it happened as God had promised. And in verse 13, and in that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the rest were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. Josephus actually writes a long bit about this, but I'll just read just the first part because I know we're over time. But Josephus says, while the holy house was on fire, everything was plunged that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught were slain. And so Josephus' 10,000 is thought to have been an estimate for the thousands that were killed, which may line up with the 7,000 that was just talked about in verse 13. In that hour there was a great earthquake, and a tenth of the city fell. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake. So it does kind of line up when you consider the thousands upon thousands that would have been slain. And the earthquake, it's not a literal earthquake. At least I don't believe I was looking at, but the sound was terrible. You have the seditious Jews on one end yelling because of the Romans coming in, yelling, about to get the Jews. And then you have people that are starving, people that are just going through all this turmoil. They're yelling. So everyone is having this loud yell to where, that's depicted as being an earthquake. It's a terrible time. And so, so I think I may end up trying to continue doing it this way, and I may put up a timeline soon. But this is kind of, what we see when we're looking at both sides of it. But overall, I think it's always good to, look at the overall picture. God knows what is happening. God cares for his people. There's judgment that is going to take place upon the enemy, whether that's Rome, whether that's Jerusalem, and God's people, they will overcome. Yes, there'll be tribulations, there'll be times of where there's struggle, you're put to death for the word of God, but we know that, there is joy to be had afterwards. God knows, and God will avenge his people. So any questions or comments? I know I didn't really ask that before we close, but any questions or comments before we do close? I had a lot to get through. All right, thank you for your attention. We'll pick up, Lord willing, next week.